Welcome to The Third Story. I'm your host, Leo Sidran. Maybe you are like me. Maybe you know a little bit about Peter Himmelman. Maybe you know that he's from Minneapolis. Maybe, in fact, you know that he grew up in the St. Louis Park suburb of Minneapolis, which is known to many as a Jewish suburb of Minneapolis, the same one from which other notable Minneapolitan Jews like the Coen brothers and Al Franken emerged. Maybe you know about his solo career as a singer-songwriter, his thoughtful, introspective, philosophical, oftentimes boisterous, rocking, funky, funny, provocative, soul-searching songs, recorded over 15 solo albums. Maybe you know his handful of albums with his early bands, Sussman Lawrence and Shangoya. Maybe you know about his award-winning children's music records. He's made a lot of them. That's how he got his Grammy nomination and all his Parents' Choice Awards, and that's what I first knew about him, that he was making music for kids. Maybe you recognize his name from the credit scroll of one of your favorite TV shows. He has scored a whole bunch of TV and film, shows like Bones and Judging Amy. That's how he got his Emmy nomination and all his ASCAP awards. Maybe you're a Bob Dylan fanatic, the kind who keeps track of all things Dylan, including his children and his children's children. In which case, maybe you recognize Peter's name as the longtime husband of Dylan's daughter, Maria. Maybe you're interested in popular Jewish culture and you recognize Peter as a practitioner of contemporary observant Judaism, a rock star who managed to keep Shabbat almost from day one. Maybe you don't know anything about him. Maybe you know everything. I doubt you know everything, but even if you think you do, the full discography, the live tapes, the movie scores, the lectures, the documentary film about him, whatever, my sense is that you wouldn't really have the full picture. He doesn't fit into a frame. Or maybe he is the frame. His work speaks for itself, and yet in many ways, I got the feeling that his life is his greatest achievement. Just being in a room with Peter is an event. At least that was my experience. We got together recently, shortly after he moved to New York, after years of living in LA. Yes, my friends, it is happening. That pendulum is swinging back east again. I was so naive to worry. I was so silly to think that New York would become irrelevant. How could I be so foolish? Even Peter Himmelman moved back here this month. The fact is that over the last year or so, I've been receiving a lot of messages, universal and personal, indicating that I should reach out to Peter. You know, those emails that say things like, you should really reach out to Peter Himmelman. So I did. And we met with both the expectation of doing an interview, but also just a legitimate curiosity about one another. And I think because of that, there was a kind of immediacy, intimacy even, about the conversation that doesn't always happen. I was very moved by his story, his process, his whole thing. Ergonomics, economics, loss, discovery, desire, faith, courage, songwriting, real estate, college tuition, meaningful work, naked performance, from the sacred to the profane. It's all here, my friends. Before I get started with the conversation, you know this, third-story.com is the place to go for all things Third Story Podcast, including the full archive. You can go back and hear all of the previous episodes, poke around, say hello, get involved, leave a message, check on the socials, subscribe, all of that goodness. And when you are fully bathed, when you have been adequately immersed in the project and you're fully on board, that's when you click on the link to patreon.com/thirdstorypodcast and get involved in a more, I don't want to say meaningful. It's not meaning. Money is not meaningful. We know this. Money is not meaning. But, you know, it pays for a meal here and there. So if you want to pay for a meal here and there, patreon.com/thirdstorypodcast is a way that you could sponsor. You could patronize me. And I don't mind being patronized by someone such as yourself. As I often do, I have compiled and curated a Spotify playlist of many of the songs and artists that we talk about in this conversation, not only Peter's music, but also music that was influential or significant to him that he speaks about in the conversation. And there are also videos on the website that you can refer to get a sense of the full trajectory, and it's pretty wild to see what Peter looked like when he started, and check him out in recent days and months and years, and see the arc of a career, of a life. And I highly encourage you, I suggest to you that you do that. Without further ado, my friends, here it is, the conversation with the thoughtful, provocative, intelligent, spiritual, menschy Peter Himmelman. Peter Himmelman, it's a long time coming to be in this room with you, man.
There were a few emails exchanged. I heard so much good about you, and then the way that you wrote your emails, which is always an important thing.
Yeah.
I was attracted to you.
Oh, well, likewise. I was thinking about the first time I heard your name, and, I realized that it's when we were both making records for baby boom music, children's music.
That's interesting. I didn't know you were on a label mate. I didn't know that there were any labels.
I know. That's a whole other story, but I made one children's music record with my dad. We made a father and son album for that
This
label.
I remember.
That's what I first knew about you, was that you were into kids' music. And then only over the years I've had an opportunity to sort of piece more of the puzzle together, although I still get the sense that I'm not anywhere near seeing the entirety of this puzzle.
You and me both.
Yeah. What we know is that you come from St. Louis Park, Minnesota.
That's right.
That's Coen Brothers territory.
It is, yeah. I mean, I didn't really know them. They went to a private school called Blake. And when I was literally like failing out of 8th grade, my mother had the idea that I should also go to Blake. And I interviewed with Blake. It was a special school.
Uh-huh.
Apparently they liked what I had to say, but my math scores were so abysmal that in order to get in, I had to take a remedial math course throughout the summer. And I was 14 years old, and I met my first girlfriend. And I never went to more than 2 remedial math courses. My parents, those were the days when parents would allow children to be feral. Mm-hmm. And they were in Israel for like a month. Mm-hmm. And I was staying with my grandma Min in her apartment, which meant I was essentially on my own at 14. Mm-hmm. And had it not been for that math, who knows, I would have known the Coen brothers and possibly, carry their gear around or something.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of kid were you if you were not a math student?
That's a good way to define who I am now. I suppose everybody loves to view themselves as different from everyone else, mm-hmm. and they truly are. Mm-hmm. I then and now could easily go into sort of a quasi-dream state, and sort of be present and not present a lot. That could just be sloth, on my part. But I see it now in a more productive way. Just this idea of trying to create from nothing necessarily sensible. It comes into the better songs that I write. I don't typically sit down and write a song about a subject. I think that's a very circumscribed way to approach it.
You define yourself as dreamlike before musical, meaning it almost seems like music became a way to harness this kind of thing about you that you have, right?
I think the music, which has just been, a vehicle, a means. I also like to draw a lot. Mm-hmm. I was really into tropical fish as a kid, and I wanted at one point to be either an oceanographer or an ichthyologist, but my assumption was that those jobs required the math skills that I just mentioned I did not have. And that probably, that was the sloth as well. I probably could have learned that math. It was just a little hard. I got into music through my sister's bedroom door. Mm-hmm. And it was, when you're hearing like a musician on the street, sometimes it's a little blurry and it's a little forgiving sometimes. And it sounds like it could be magical. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you approach it and it's even more so. Sometimes it's abysmal, and it was that distance that created it. Mm-hmm. So I would listen to my sister, who's 6 years older, mm-hmm. and I must have been in like 4th grade. And she was playing the Beatles 45s and some Diana Ross. And I especially was moved by, I forget the name of the album, Eric Burdon and the Animals,
sure.
with the House of the Rising Sun. Mm-hmm. And if not for that Farfisa organ solo, I could have been a doctor, but that also required math.
Boy, this math thing is going to follow you around, I feel like, for the rest of your life.
At least for this podcast.
Yeah, right.
I played in bands since I was in 6th grade and became very absorbed by that. And that just really took me away from academics, although I was an avid reader all the time. And then just through an incredible set of providential circumstances, which still bewilder me to this day, I wound up in North Minneapolis, which had been really the home of the Jews at one time. They departed, and then African Americans took over their homes, and it was the words North Minneapolis when I was growing up. Unfortunately, it's just a sort of a sad thing. They had a scary connotation.
Yes.
If you went north of Highway 55 by Fort Worth Parkway, it felt like you were going to get in big trouble.
Yeah.
But somehow one evening, as feral teenagers, I was with my cousin, a brilliant keyboard player named Jeff Victor, and we had these guys from North Minneapolis come and jam with us in his parents' basement in St. Louis Park. And we were drinking Ripple wine, and we were high, and we were only must have been ninth grade. We didn't have licenses. And they took us on a ride. We went to somebody's house by the airport. We picked up some other people. And about 1 a.m, we wound up in North Minneapolis at the home of Alexander O'Neill, if you know who he is. He'd made a lot of R&B records. I think in the 80s. He was in the Prince camp, but I think he was a person who was not going to be subservient in any way to any man, and not Prince either. But he went on to have his own extensive solo career. But he really taught me so much about funk and using my right hand. And Peter, y'all got to chop that rhythm with your right hand. Otherwise, you can't stop. Otherwise, you're going to be a basement guitar player. And he was this incredible person. He sang so powerfully and so loud over our twin reverbs that he didn't need a microphone. We played like Lou Rawls, You'll Never Find. And he just was like, who is this guy? Apparently, he'd been a football player. I saw him beat the living shit out of a guy, too, one time. That's a whole other story. And yet I love this guy, Alexander O'Neill. He taught me so much. And then I went into a reggae calypso band called Shangoya. This was before I started doing all these other albums with this new wave band.
Yes. So your development is in Minneapolis is tied to basically to the black music scene then.
Yeah, very much so.
And that's what you were into.
I just found, this is an odd thing, but maybe you could relate to it. And I think this is universal. It's not just for musicians or artists, but let's use that as the metaphor. You're hearing something and you're playing it. The sound or the personages that I most took on was Luther Allison, Chicago electric blues player.
Yes.
And, maybe he was, when I was 14 or 15, he was, I don't know, 40, 35, looking good. He had that album cover where he's got that big spliff in his mouth. And I just, it's almost like you adopt a persona, not only a sound, but whatever I was, the grandson of Rose Wexler who spoke, "Oi, weet ik is meer eyes and shine." She'd speak, it didn't seem like I would ever be able to reproduce my species with that sort of thing. And this other idea of becoming or adopting some homeopathic vestige of Luther Allison, it just felt better to me. And he's still there. When I get on stage, I'm a much different person than I am in real life, entirely different, so much so that I don't quite, I know who this facet is, but I don't relate to it often. I wish I did. I'd be a lot, more happy and successful.
Well, there's always that thing, right? It happens again and again with, especially I think with songwriters who kind of, in one way or another, end up saying, look, if I could live the person I wrote about, I wouldn't have to write about this person. I wouldn't have to write these songs.
So true. Or if I could speak about this in a less oblique fashion, if I were brave enough to even speak these ideas to myself rather than have them masked. Certainly the songs benefit from the masking. In some ways, people that perform or that go on stage, or maybe even people that write, they want to be loved in a certain way. There's a paucity of something, of communication, of intimacy. And I was a well-loved kid, and I think I'm a well-loved man. But still there is that reigning sense of isolation, one from the other, and a constant need to express and make connections.
You spoke briefly about this idea of always feeling a little bit different, right? Like when I said, what kind of kid were you? You said, well, maybe a lot of people would say this, but I certainly feel this way. I felt like I was different. It's not surprising then that you would identify somebody like Luther Allison as the kind of the skin that you want to crawl into, because that's about as different as a Jewish kid from St. Louis Park as you can find.
Well, there was a strength there, physical strength. I assume there was a sexual strength, I assumed.
Yeah.
You know, these were things that I wanted to possess. I wanted to, in a way that felt unique to me, even though I was, adopting something else. But every sort of original idea is an adaptation. And what makes it so original or masterful is that you do it in a great and unique way.
Right. I sometimes think about that as the gift of failure, in a sense that we will always end up with ourselves. You know, no matter who you attempt to emulate or to copy or to take on, you really are just, you're going to do it in your own way. You can't be anybody else.
And it's possible that you can't learn any other way. In athletics, you're modeling someone. And it's in that modeling that you gain some mastery. And then if you continue and you have some courage, you'll develop branches that are original.
So let's talk about what happens then, though, because we haven't even gotten to your career yet. I mean, we're still in the sort of proto-career aspect of what was happening. You're in Minneapolis. You're hanging out on the north side. And then what? How do you become a guy who gets signed to a label and makes records and starts this thing?
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun for me to look at the path.
Yeah.
And I look at the path as providential with a capital P, because there's so many things that are so odd and in their strangeness so beautiful to me. I'm looking at my own life.
Yeah.
It's not like I'm beautiful by any means, but the path that was sort of laid before me is mysterious and beautiful to me, and I think about it a lot.
Yeah.
Even being in New York right now, and even being in this room with you and your lovely quiet dog. When I graduated high school, I did miserably. My mother was unloading some stuff from her home, and she gave me all sorts of letters that I'd written that were sort of sweet and kind of acerbic at the same time, because I couldn't be that vulnerable to tell my parents how much I love them. And along with that other stuff, there was a report card of mine from 8th grade. And while I knew that I did not excel, it was like a kick in the stomach, and I had a pity for that young child that I was. It was D-minuses. It was abysmal. And part of the reason was, not to get too carried away here, by happenstance, I began my sexual life at an incredibly young age. That may have had a lot to do with why I didn't do well in school. And it sounds kind of funny, and like, who wouldn't want that? I get that. But it was like a voltage had come into my life that was way too hot for the wire.
Yeah.
And it was extremely isolating.
Yeah.
Because there was no one to talk to. My older brother didn't know about this stuff. None of my friends even could conceive of it. And it made me very lonely. And it's also, once you have that experience, you don't go right back to studying flax production in Iowa or whatever they were teaching in social studies. You become slightly predatory. And the people that I would associate with were likely those who would want to participate in this as well, continue it. So I didn't know anything about school when I graduated. Brown was a hue. It didn't mean anything to me. And they came to me, for some reason I had enough credits to graduate in my, after Christmas vacation. They said, well, you have enough credits, some counselor. And I left. And I was at my house for about 4 days playing guitar. And my dad said, you got to get a job. And I got a job at Pickwick, which is, for those of you who don't know, maybe you remember Musicland. Back when they had record stores, Pickwick was the distribution center. And I worked in the warehouse. And I worked with people who were lifers there. They were older than me. And I remember the first day I was on, the first week I was there, what we had to do is pick requisition orders for all the different Musicland retail stores. So if they needed quarter flash posters and pens in the Miami store or something, it took, in one day's work, the average was 7 stores could be serviced. So I would join the lifers out for lunch before it was too cold to go out there, and everyone would get high. And I got high too, and I came back into the warehouse, and I could see the inefficiencies that were glaring.
Sure.
Well, you need to take your cart with you. Don't bring everything to the cart. I did like 28 orders when the average was 7. I brought, the tally to the floor manager.
Yes.
He brought me into the office, and of course I was going to get a raise. It would be embarrassing just to be this little kid. He says to me, if you ever do this again, you are fucking fired immediately. Next day it was 6 orders just to be safe. So I realized, that this music idea had to be serious.
Because this is the alternative.
That's like the alternative. I wasn't going to be a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, and started a band called, the way that it happened, I got a call from somebody, this guy, his name is Buddy Cohen, and he had seen some tapes that I had made in the TV production class at St. Louis Park High School. And everyone was then enjoined to become a participant in the Peter Himmelman special. This wasn't my idea. This was the teacher's idea. And somebody named Buddy Cohen saw the tapes of me like doing comedy skits or whatever, music, and he asked if I would come and audition for this public access TV show called Steamroller. And at the time I was playing with this reggae and calypso band called Shangoya. Well, the first thing I did when I got on the show is I brought them on the show.
Yes.
And then my name on the show for some reason was Sussman Lawrence.
Yes.
I have a friend named Alan Sussman, and I used to say to my girlfriend, I'm going to Sussman's house. And her sister said, who's that guy with that very weird first name? Sussman Lawrence, like a guy who would run around nude in his home named Sussman Lawrence, some English manor home.
So you kind of developed a character.
Yeah, and I made a band with my friends, and they were high school friends.
Yeah. And were these kids going to go to college? Did they go to college?
They were all on their way to college. And, I have powers of persuasion, at least I used to have them.
Man.
And I said, let's just stay with this thing.
Oh, my God.
They were such expert musicians.
Yeah.
And they were already my best friends. It was there's another strange providential thing. I kept churning out this music because now I had like a forum and we had all sorts of fans, and, we would play wherever the Husker Du played. We never saw each other because we were playing the same venues on different nights. We got very successful in the Midwest, and we moved out to New York. I didn't move for a while. This is essential to my story, I guess. I don't want to blab on here. But
I want to play this out.
Well, so I was writing songs like I'm Your Fireman.
Yeah.
They're really good and funny songs.
Yeah.
Because I was influenced by Prince, like Soft and Wet, like How Dare You. So my song was, I'm your fireman, show me where you're burning. Oh, baby, I'm coming, I'll be there to hose you down. Baby, Let Me Be Your Cigarette was another huge hit. Torture Me. They were just kind of funny songs.
Yeah.
But all the while, my dad was dying of stage 4 lymphoma. And my dad was, to briefly describe him, he was such a hero to me. He was a United States Marine, a Jew, which doesn't happen often.
Not often.
And if you ever see your dad fearlessly sort of counter injustice, anti-Semitism, somebody's being like, cruel to a woman, he would take and throw a guy up on the wall. He wouldn't say, hey, watch it. He would just take action.
He was physically strong.
He was strong as can be, and he was so warm and self-effacing and so funny. And all my cousins that weren't even blood relatives used to come and just sit in front of him, soaking in. He didn't have wisdom. He just had presence. And he got this diagnosis of stage 4 lymphoma when I was 18, still playing in that Calypso band. That was the end of my childhood. In a day, in a night, it all ended. I started reading all these Jerzy Kaczynski books, like they couldn't have been more depressing, made me even more depressed. And so while the Sussman Lawrence music was going on, I was writing a whole other strain of music that I just didn't really care to take. They wouldn't mesh well with I'm Your Fireman. Yeah. And on the last Father's Day of my dad's life, we were playing in Amory, Wisconsin at the Country Dam. And we were playing our hits.
Yeah.
And
Fireman, Cigarette.
And I just was like, I literally knew my dad, this was it. And I felt so torn. What am I doing? Why am I playing these ridiculous songs? And as I said, I was an unusual person.
Yes.
And for some reason, more for the band than for anybody else, I remember I had these custom-made suits. They were like really cool shark skin suits. And I came out for the encore only in my beetle boots and my skinny, hairy Jewish legs with my ball sack swinging, completely nude except for the boots. And the band was looking at me. They'd see me do a lot of stuff, and they weren't laughing so much as, I don't know exactly what they thought, but it was a way for me to tell them they were my closest friends. And they had no idea. They had the kernel of the idea. They had the skin of the idea. But I never talked about it. And this was just a way to say, I'm in pain. And I went back home because I was living at my parents' house most of the time. We were on the road most of the time too. And it was getting early in the morning. And it was Father's Day the next day. My cousins would be coming. My mom had said, Peter, write a funny song for your dad. And I didn't buy cologne or tie. It was too late. There was all sorts of like locks in the refrigerator for the party. And you know how it is when you're writing a song, you do go into a sort of a dream state. And you also understand you have only this guitar, 6 strings, and you only have so much time. So those two processes, the extreme tangible, the harsh architecture of now, married with some sort of emotional need to express, one without the other is insignificant. And in no time, which is the way all the good songs come, except for certain editing, although this was not edited at all, I wrote a love song to my dad. I didn't have any idea it was coming. It just came. And I recorded it on a 4-track Porta studio. And I cried at the end of the take. It's just me. The sun was kind of coming up now. And I reached reflexively to like record it again because it was a bad take. I cried. I'm like 23 years old. No one wants to cry for posterity. And for some brave reason, or I don't know what, Probably the same thing that made me get nude in the Beatle boots, just to communicate. I left it. And I brought it upstairs on the cassette. All my cousins were there. I had a glint in my eye. My mom might have realized this wasn't funny. And as soon as I put the cassette tape in, strange too, the tape hiss alone caused everyone to cry. They only heard a bar or two of the song and they left the room. There's about 30 people. And they loved my dad. He was big.
Yeah.
So just he and I sat listening to that song, holding each other now for the first time, as only music can do, communicated the idea that this is happening. You're not going to live. There's no more treatments. You know, it's over. And he carried the cassette with him in the breast pocket of his Munsingwear shirt till he died a couple months later. And they played the song at a funeral. And the song sat in a closet for about a year. And, I mean, the story is too rich for the telling on this thing. Suffice it to say that unexpected piece was part and parcel of what got me a record deal on Island Records. I walked into Lou Malia, the president's office. He was a new president at the time. He had seen my video.
With Sussman or your
Oh,
own
no,
solo
Sussman was
done.
I think he'd heard the Sussman demos and he rejected them.
Yeah.
I was so done with Sussman at this point. And I made a record. I told the guys in Sussman Lawrence, I'm doing this, and I paid them to play on it.
But it was a Peter Himmelman record.
Yeah, and he liked it. He wanted to sign me, and I said to him, look, because I'd had a video on MTV, I knew somebody there, and they played it on 120 minutes. They're like indie channel.
Yeah.
And then I got a bunch of people in my apartment in Hell's Kitchen to write letters. You bring a pen, you bring a typewriter, and there were a bunch of approving letters about
So they were flooded with fan mail.
I don't know if that really made a difference, but the next week or 2 weeks after, they put my video on medium rotation without a deal of any kind.
Wow.
So that was I called somebody at New York Newsday, this writer, a great writer named Wayne Robbins. I said, I think this is a story. He goes, yeah. So that week, a lot of things coalesced. I said to Lou, sign me now. Put this out as my first record, and I won't take it down the street to any number of other record labels with whom you probably won't win in a bidding war. He laughed at me. He goes, let's meet Chris Blackwell at the Sherry Netherland.
So you had chutzpah, and he liked it.
He liked it. I had chutzpah. More than chutzpah, I had a vision that needed to be fulfilled somehow.
Did you believe what you were saying?
I did. I did believe it. I believed, well, like, you know, when someone likes you, when you like someone else, you know it feels auspicious.
Yes.
Not, most days don't, but you feel there's some sort of power that's revealed. Not that it just came about, it's always there, but you pull back the curtain to it, and it was there for you. So I could have done many things during that time. Now I think I should have seized and done more with it. And the biggest thing I did at the time was decide I wanted to get married. And that was all happening then. And that happened as well in a very short time. I reflect on that and say, how could I recreate that again?
Yeah, right.
And it probably would be manifested in ways I couldn't imagine. It wasn't like, we're going to sell tens of millions of records. Or somebody said to me something interesting the other day. I'm going to be working at the United States Army War College in a week or so. It's where you go to become a United States general. And they said, when you're younger, it's a time of acquiring. And when you're older, if it fits you, and if, I happen to be very judgmental, I think. If you're doing it well, then you become altruistic. That you now use primarily your resources for the development of other people.
Yeah, and the question is, can you get there without putting in that time on your own development first?
I don't think so. I think it's a natural channel. The question is when it's time to let go, and I'm not talking about letting go of a career or anything like that. It's letting go of the need for the love of strangers. Why, a wise friend of mine asked a month or so before we went to New York, what is it? She's herself she's a history teacher at UCLA, but an incredible performer.
Yeah.
What is it about us that needs the love of strangers? And what benefit is there to letting go of that? Because it's artificial. It's filling a childish need with a fantastical sort of product.
Yeah, and it's an addiction like any other.
100%. And there comes a time, I think in my case, it's come too late or later than I would have liked, to make a really radical shift toward that end, the first part is, what can I get? How can I aggrandize myself? You're making things hopefully that people like and are inspired by.
If you never move beyond that first layer, you still have brought an enormous amount of meaning and joy and influence to people's lives.
Yeah, and I 100% agree. And I also think that there are, at least for me, there are ways that are smaller and they're more intimate. And they do call for a greater degree. The word vulnerability jumps to mind, and it's probably not apt. They call on something that's even more selfless. It feels painful, the work that I see having to do. There's a sense of pain, not useless pain, but pain in wresting myself from this ego, which has been a propellant to everything I have. It's almost like, well, what's over that rise? And I happen to think, in my case, it all has to do with this concerted effort to sort of, to give in a different way. It doesn't mean I'm going to stop writing songs and hopefully they're inspirational too. It's just not enough.
Yes.
And I figure if you look at the clock, which is something that I didn't do when I was 40, and I know how fast time goes by in 25 years, and it goes because the piece of the pie for a child who's 2 is 2 big pieces.
Yes.
Person who's 87, it's just 87 razor sharp slivers. Like what will happen in this time has become meaningful to me.
I get the sense, in the little that I know about you and the sort of arc of your career and your life and your general movements, that you have been a kind of searcher, though, and you've been on this journey. I mean, to think of all of the places that you have taken yourself and all of the personal development that you have not only kind of undertaken but done in a public way. I mean, I suppose that's what you're saying, is that you integrated all of your search into the work so people could see it. So, for example, when you became a religious Jew, when you got in touch with your Judaism, that became part of your identity. That became part of what your fans knew about you.
Yeah, I mean, I look at that, and it's a complicated subject. For me, the Judaism, which I've been doing, whoever is Jewish is always doing Jewish, whether they're avoiding it or not. I mean, you're dealing with it in your own way. I don't think I've ever been comfortable with it. I've never found my place. That isn't to say there isn't a place that exists, but, keeping Shabbat, let's say, which for those of you who don't know, it's, you can't work on Shabbat. It's complicated, but you don't use electricity for, the reasons behind them are beautiful and meaningful. I'm not going to talk about that now necessarily. They mean a lot to me, and so I do them. But I don't know that it's somebody say, well, does it, make you happier, better person? No, I don't think that's the point. The point is about service, serving humankind, starting with your own spouse. That's the first place that you have to serve, and many times the most difficult place, because nobody's ever going to give you that amount of shit and that amount of love and know you that well, and they peel you away. And it extends out to your kids and your family and your friends and your community. But for me, there's also, even since I was little, and the word God is really, it's a hard word to use because immediately we go anthropomorphic. And anytime you try to describe God or have a conception of God, you must know that you have the wrong one. You know, you'll never have it. But for me, in the vaguest way, there's any word I use now is going to be wrong. So let's just leave a dash there. That I feel in service to. That the creator of will, and there I just use the word creator, scratch that, must have a will. I feel like I'm like trying to walk in step with that will, with the will of humanity and the will of this, leave a dash. And I'm not successful at either of them. You know, I'm not making claims that I'm good at any of this stuff. But I think what made me different as a kid, and maybe makes me a little different now, is that I always had an unformed cognizance of this dash. So it wasn't a new thing I adopted. It was giving voice to something I always felt. And in some ways, the last place I ever found it was in Judaism, which to me was insanely meaningless, boring shit. Hanging around, reading this and that, taught by people that had no idea what they were teaching. I was interested in it, so after bar mitzvah class, you could go on to something called confirmation class, which was very imitative of Christianity.
Totally. I never understood why they gave it that name.
Well, because they, dying to fit in. Yeah. That was a thing. So I went to the class, and in almost every Hebrew prayer book, there's a prayer. It says, Mechal kel chayim bechesed, mechaye metim barachamim rabim, who raises the dead in infinite kindness and mercy. And I asked in the class, we say that if you're a prayerful Jew of almost any stripe, you say that 3 times a day. What is it? I never heard about that. It sounds scary and weird.
Yeah, right.
So my mom got a phone call, and I knew the rabbi called, and these were really poignant questions. Your son is asking, he's going to be a scholar. I was kicked out of the class for disturbing the class. That's how removed I was from thinking there was anything in Judaism. And when my dad died and I moved to New York, I was in such a propitious place to rediscover these ideas.
Is that when you reconnected with it?
Yeah, I mean...
Because I've been sitting here wondering, what kind of person would you have been if your father hadn't died then? What effect did that have on your direction?
It's weird to talk about... this is something I mentioned with the Army War College, and I talked to them about things that I was interested in speaking about. Yeah. Purpose, value, but mostly beauty. And a couple of the professors there said, well, I do believe that while they're aesthetically inclined, and these are people who have multiple PhDs, the students are going to be generals. Yes. They're incredible people, men and women. While they're aesthetically inclined, it seems to me to be quite dubious that they would be finding the word beauty relevant in this particular case. I'm like, well, I'd like to push back on you. Yeah. Okay, I'm listening. The pushback took a while. I finally landed on these ideas of love. The love that many soldiers express in a very kind of microcosmic or homeopathic dose way, I always like to say. Musicians have it too on stage. The dependence, the sort of little war that goes on stage between acceptance from the audience and giving. And the camaraderie. And there's a form of intimacy there that I have with my close male friends that rivals any kind of love I've ever had with anyone. It's so deep. And I started talking about that to this general, and he paused. He's, I said, when you come back, or you're no longer in the service, you're retired, is it conceivable to say that it's hard to find that same intimacy in your wife?
Well, Peter, in terms of camaraderie, call it love, I think beauty is, in this case, entirely relevant.
And what would I be without my dad dying? I have no idea. And this is why I brought this up. Is it possible to say there's beauty in this tragedy? And everything I have is a catalyst of that abrupt upheaval. So much underpinning of the nature of my songs, lyrically mostly.
Impermanence. One of the first major statements that you make is talking about how everything is fleeting.
Right. And the other statement that I made, which all these songs were just riffs that I wrote really quickly. Only coming back to them did I see that I could never have written them had I just tried to write a hit song or something. The song Mission of My Soul, which is, it's got 4 chords, it's not some sort of masterpiece, but it does a good job of talking about, it's almost like where I wanted to be when I wrote the song. It was a song to my wife, because I do very much believe, and not in anthropomorphic terms, but this idea that people that marry, they're living out a sort of temporal existence of some previous, call it a non-spatial existence, that there was a disembodied familiarity. And a lot of my songs talk about that. I remember going to some poetry class, and there was a guy saying, these are the words I don't want you to use. Soul, spirit. I mean, I get why they don't want to use them, because they're overused.
Yes.
And they're not used in a way that you would think about them. But there is no better English word.
Yeah. I have to confess that part of the reason I asked this question about the loss and how it affected you is because this is going to sound probably so ridiculous for me to say, but my father is very much in my life still. 76 years old, he just turned. And his father died when he was 26 years old. That had a profound impact on what he did.
Wow.
I could feel from him how motivated he was to do certain kinds of things, how fearless he was, in the way that you, even as you kind of identified as not being fearless because you recognized in that moment that you got to walk down to meet Chris Blackwell at the Sherry Netherlands, that you believed 100% what you were saying. But I see that as totally fearless to walk into a room like that. That's a fearlessness I don't possess. But I'm going to tell you that I think the reason I don't possess it is because I don't think I've ever needed to.
Wow, it's a very powerful statement, and I know what you mean, and it's going to sound odd too. I know exactly what you mean, and I never feel distant from my dad either. I'm not saying it's just as good, and I've asked people, like my friends, what's it like?
Yeah.
To have a dad at whatever age you are, like. It's just a feeling that I carry, but it's as potent as it can be.
Yes.
And fearlessness, by the way, is not a condition that anyone can ever hold. I believe that human beings, unless you're some sort of psychopathy, we're by nature very fearful. I'm a very anxious, fearful person. I wake up in the morning a lot of times with just... anxiety is free floating. But there have been moments strung together, just like moments of inspiration for music. So you're not always inspired and you're not always ready to work. But let's say you've done that hundreds or thousands of times over many, many years.
Sure.
It sure looks like that's who you are.
Yes.
You have to overlook the majority of the time when you were not in any place like that. But you understand what fearlessness looks like. And back to the Army for a second. And I have a kind of a kinship with that because my dad's identity as a Marine, he didn't do anything good in the Marine. He wasn't like any kind of, whatever. He just has the uniform, and he took a lot of shit for anti-Semitism. He once got into a fist fight with a commandant of the base who called him a sheeny.
What's a sheeny?
It's a word, the old word for like a kike.
Really?
He said to the base at large, he goes, "We got 3 niggers and a sheeny on this base." And my dad smacked him in the jaw. They had a fight. And he wound up in, the brig. Their mission is to go into a situation knowing that they can die, or that they will put others, beloved others, into a situation where they can and do die. It's, on stage, to have a little sense of that and understand that the exemplar, the ultimate exemplar of that is like that. Or maybe it's quieter. Maybe the exemplar is a man who decides to devote his entire life to his family.
Well, that's where I hear you going again and again. I mean, the way you describe the work that you want to do now, that you think maybe you're pivoting towards or transitioning towards or going towards now, which is a more one-on-one, direct, personal, you describe it as being painful to do. But on the other hand, the closest thing that I've heard you describe in your life that resembles that is the relationship with your family.
Yeah, I think that I came from it's a very, it was a supportive family, and it's rare. My mom used to ask me, "What do you think of this family?" I said, "It's pretty normal. I mean, it seems right." From my lived experience, 6 people, my dad and my younger sister who died in a car accident, they love and support one another, even through disagreements. There has been no derision, nothing but support. That's extraordinarily rare, and I don't say that by any means of bragging. I feel it's a resource that I need to do something with.
Yeah. Well, I will say, when you describe not going to college, I mean, I think there is another version of that story in another family in which it's a complete chaotic, tumultuous problem for a Jewish family that the boy doesn't, especially an intelligent boy, doesn't go to college.
In the Jewish world, at least anyone that I've ever been a part of, like we would sit around in LA with these families on Shabbat.
Yeah.
And everybody be talking about, well, where their kid is going. And this one, my daughters went to great schools. They went to Barnard and this and that. And my kids did too. And I felt like...
All your kids went to good schools?
Yeah. And I felt sort of, kind of out of the discussion. I played at all those schools. I played at Stanford. We played at Northwestern. I didn't think anything of it. We played at, University
just
of Pennsylvania.
part of your career, that was the circuit.
Yeah, just as another gig.
Yeah.
I was so like clueless. I did whatever. So who are these people? I'm in a band and they're at school. And we're doing different things. It didn't occur to me that there were incredibly high achievers doing something somewhat similar to what I was trying to do, which was make a mark in the world.
Nonetheless, if your kids had come to you, any one of them, and said, "I don't want to go to college," what would you have done?
Well, I would have said, "What's your plan?"
What was your plan?
My plan was, I had so much momentum.
Yeah.
And also my dad was dying around the time when I should have been like prepping for the SAT, which I never took.
Yeah.
No one was really thinking about me at that time. Also, I asked my mom about that. She says, "You just had so much momentum. We knew what you were going to do." And if they had a plan, I would have saved myself a boatload of money. And I would have said, God bless you,
I hear that. I absolutely hear that. Right. I mean, in a funny way, college is something that we do on the way to our plan, to help us figure out what the plan is. What are we going to do next? How are we going to be prepared for it?
If I hadn't been married to my wife for 31 years, someone who was extremely well educated, extremely articulate, I wouldn't sound like I do. I don't know. I would be sleeping on urine-soaked straw. Seriously. My dad would say to me, because he never really went to college. He never graduated. He was an entrepreneur, brilliant in his way. He says, I know you're not going to school, but you have to keep reading he didn't say this in these words, but in a really concerted, really diligent way. Otherwise, everyone's going to pass you by. There's literally not a day when I don't think about that. So you become like a weird autodidact.
Well, that's what you are. And I wonder if to some extent it is in response to not having had that formal education where you say, that's right, I need to be reading more than all you motherfuckers. I need to be out here totally taking care of my brain.
Yeah, it's something that I react to. It's like I don't look at it like shameful or anything, but it's like a sensitive spot with me, especially when I'm talking to people that, have gone to all these schools. Usually it turns out it doesn't, at some point, it just doesn't matter.
Yes.
And I'm sure that if I had gone to school, I'd have had at least a commensurate number of advantages and perhaps disadvantages.
Sure. It does seem to me that there is another Jewish, non-college educated Minnesota singer-songwriter who we all know about, who made a mark on the world, Bob Dylan. And when you talk about your hyper-educated wife who has influenced the way you sound today, I can't have this conversation with you without bringing up the fact that Bob Dylan is your father-in-law.
Yeah, I mean, I thought a lot about the fact that he never went to school. And like any musician who's writing songs, he was a huge influence on me musically. I identified with him in some way. He was a kind of classic Jewish person. He was more Minnesotan than I was up in the Iron Range, but it was basically the same thing.
Were you aware of that when you started?
Like when I was a little kid?
Or high school age?
Oh, yeah, high school for sure. I think I got into his songs hard and late.
Mm-hmm.
As I mentioned, I was really into funk and Luther Allison. And once I started to kind of, as anybody, kind of open up the whole thing and look at the possibilities, I could identify, well, that's something. Well, he was also seemed to me to be very fearless and very iconoclastic as well. It's something that people always want to be. I have a niece who's extremely talented and very iconoclastic. Mm-hmm. And I've sometimes said, everyone wants to be you, but it's a price you have to pay. You have to walk that way and take these chances. It looks good on paper, but not a lot of people are going to sign up for it. And there's also a certain thing with people that are very, quote, creative or produce things. They take chances, but they're also extremely organized, and they're very diligent. They're not just passed out getting high all the time. Many of them wake up early or have very set, rigorous schedules for work. I do.
Yes.
And because I'm not on a label now and nobody's expecting much from me, it becomes difficult to create those structures for oneself. But that's the other thing that's, when I walked into your house, I said, well, when I heard you speak and saw even the small things that you wrote in the emails, this guy who does all this creative stuff is a very free-thinking person, but the free thought is underpinned by organization. Your dad is probably exactly the same way. That is
exactly what I learned from watching him. It's incredible that you say that. What I learned over time when I reflected on watching a creative person through 30 years of their career, now more, was the conditions around the work were very stable, and it allowed for an enormous freedom within the work. So I have endeavored to set up my life in a similar way where basically I don't have to think about the kind of mundane questions, and I can work.
I mean, even from a physical point of view, that your gear is laid out in such a way that it's all within reach.
Yes.
So that your intellectual process isn't interrupted all the time by having to walk or go somewhere else. It's all very organized.
Yes.
And I think that's something, I work with people, songwriters and things. It's not something that they would imagine is always there.
Yes.
The other thing that's really motivating is, we mentioned the baby boom records.
Yes.
That's a good example of how creative things get done. I'd had 2 or 3 kids by that time. Somebody came to me and said, I need X by X date. I'm going to pay you X amount of money.
Yep.
That is the ideal forcing frame for any project.
Yes.
Give me a subject or a need, a time limit, and a paycheck.
Yeah.
And the paycheck does more than just pay your rent.
Yeah.
It also says, I value you. And if somebody values you, your sense of self-judgment is diminished. You're able to work more freely.
I love that. And that is the difference between making a record, even if a label is behaving as a bank. It's not the same as saying, I value you, because you're right. When somebody says, I want to pay you to do what you do, it does create freedom.
I mean, I thought having a schedule with the record company, for me, there were enormous pressures that were essentially insurmountable. And I asked around. I may be one of the few artists that wasn't like hugely successful or famous that got off a major label on a legal technicality. Because when my first child, who's 29, Isaac, was born, I was on the road with, gigs and promotional things probably 250 days that year. And then we had other kids, and as much as I wanted to do this, it wasn't sustainable for me. I couldn't see how this was going to work.
And you were in L.A. at this point?
Yeah, I was in L.A.
Keeping Shabbat?
Keeping Shabbat the whole time I was on a major label.
So would you go home?
Oh, I wouldn't always go home, but that was really difficult. Keeping Shabbat when in whatever city I was in.
Alone, wherever you were?
Yeah, or sometimes with somebody. Sometimes I'd be so tired I'd spend 25 hours in a hotel room with some food and a stack of books and never emerge till the sun went down on Saturday night. We had a gig. Those gigs were always interesting.
Sure.
They were the weirdest.
After you've been locked in for a day by yourself.
Yeah, just like, oh man. So when you get those record deals, at least in the old days, you had a mini max. So if you had 3 records or 4 record deal, if they didn't drop you, they'd either give you the mini or the max. And if you didn't sell a lot, you got the mini. And if you took the mini, you're signed up again. Now, if the record goes and it's your 4th record, the mini is huge. And it's still unrecouped. Mini is massive. You couldn't dream of what the mini would be these days.
Right.
And if they pay you 1 cent less, which they always did, they gave you a fair offer, which also was like huger than you could ever imagine today. As soon as it dipped a penny below the mini, you're a free agent, but nobody was going to walk. I did. I just didn't feel it was sustainable as a career.
You wanted to stay home.
I mean, I didn't stay home. I got on an indie label, and I kept going out, but I knew that I was somehow cheating them. They want you to be like a toaster.
Yes.
Shut up, heat up when it's time to press you down and do your thing. They don't want to hear about Shabbat. They'd assert, rather I had like a coke problem. Do you remember the engineer Don Smith? He did a lot of Tom Petty stuff.
Yeah.
So he was a great friend of mine. He did one of my last records before he died. And I remember we were in Memphis at Ardent Studios, and he's out smoking his Tipperillo.
Yeah.
He's looking up at the sky, and we're waiting for 3 stars, which is one way you know it's dark enough. He goes,
Peter, looking for 3 stars is pretty weird, but it's a lot better than looking for 3 grams of bro for Stevie Nicks.
It may not be always a pleasant thing to have your artistic narrative or your press release lead with keeps Shabbat, you know.
Well, for sure, it's never as cool as, like, you know, he decided to become a Seminole Indian and
Right.
he started studying or went to an ashram or
Right.
something. Because the way Jews have been portrayed actually by other Jews in movies, the Jew has had this sort of nebbishy kind of quality, desexualized, highly overly intellectualized. It's complete false, but that is the image. But when I told Lou Malia he wanted to set me up on a tour with Sting or something, I said I started keeping this thing called Shabbos.
Yeah.
And I was pretty funny with Lou, and he'd laugh a lot. And he looks at me, what? I said, yeah, I'm keeping, you know, Shabbat. I won't be able. He laughed. He belly laughed. He thought I was full of shit. And then when I explained it, he was really supportive of it. So I take back the 3 grams of coke thing. It was a pain in the ass for him.
Yes.
But I believe that he saw something there, maybe because he was a lapsed Catholic, that he could relate to.
Yes.
And that was, you know, completely different than anything he'd ever seen. And he liked the music, so. But it was not the lead.
I've never really addressed it. I am not a religious Jew. I have a strong sense of Jewish identity. I have some traditions that are very important to me. But I will say, as a not so religious Jew, I have a kind of an uncomfortable relationship with religious Jews.
Right.
Not you, but the idea. And part of it is because I don't know what it is, or I feel insecure about it. I feel
Well, here's something you might want to think about. It's guided my thinking. It's a feeling I have. First of all, to say someone is religious, and you should also know that, not to go too deep into Judaism if you don't want to, but what the hell?
Yeah.
There's no word for religion in Hebrew. There's not a root word for religion. In other words, there's just life.
Yeah.
And to have a religious life as sort of segued off from life is completely nonsensical. So, like, sitting in the chair watching your dog's belly go up and down, is that religious? It certainly can be. And when you say someone is religious, we understand what that means, that they're pious and devotional.
Yes.
It's analogous to somebody being in an inspired moment with music.
Yes.
It happens very rarely that any person with a beard or wearing a yarmulke or not is religious. That's a heightened state. There are people that are practicing or even pretending to be religious. But if you looked in my mind, most of the time when I'm sitting in the morning davening chakras with my tefillin on, you'd say to yourself, damn, that is some unreligious shit going on in this guy's mind.
Yes. But I also understand, and you alluded to it earlier, most of the time in our lives, we are not the thing that we are pretending to be or trying to be. But you can't get there if you're not creating the conditions to do it. You're not going to write a song if you don't sit down and pick up the guitar.
I mean, you're hitting on a beautiful thing here. Then even in Judaism, there's something called a related word, and whenever words are related in Judaism, there's usually some reason. You ever heard Shena Punim?
Sure.
So Shena Panim in Sephardic means face.
Yeah.
Punim is the same word in like a Ashkenazi.
Yeah.
But it means face. Panemius, panemiut, means your inner self. And that one of the goals of probably art, of everything, certainly of Judaism, is to create no divisions between your face to the world and to yourself and to who you are, who you truly are, which is a lifetime process. And where there is less and less division, those are the most beautiful moments of your life. When your daughter was born, there must have been a very thin veil between your face and who you were as a person. when you're on stage and when you're moving the audience and they're moving you. For me, I become most who I am in a way. I have cried and wept on a song. I've screamed in laughter with my band. I've stopped a song in the middle of the recent show in Chicago, and I said to the audience, do you know what we say when we're going to kill the audience tonight? We're going to go out and kill them.
Yeah.
And some woman in the front row, she got it.
Yeah.
She said, you're going to, I don't remember exactly what she said, you're going to erase some of our physicality so that our spirits can transcend. We become the inner and the face, become more
Become
one.
the same.
That's the role. If you get up on stage to have some sort of conception of what your role is, it doesn't have to be some long meditation.
Yeah.
There's a lot of self-aggrandizement that naturally goes on with it, and it's part of it. But I think it's helpful to have the proportions right.
Both can be true. Like, performance can be an act of generosity. And you can also be receiving from the audience. They're receiving from you,
Totally.
and they're giving to you. It's not either or.
It's like breathing.
Yeah.
You know, somebody said to me recently, like, how do you conceive of breathing?
Yeah.
And most people, myself, you can all, that's kind of the first act. But the exhalation, which is so obvious, which could be analogous to the giving back, is equally vital. Ask anybody with terrible asthma. It's such a two-part thing.
Oh, man. And, like the yogic thing is all about the exhale. It's you're focusing on really fully exhaling.
Right. And I studied karate for many years, and there was no talk about when you inhale.
Yeah.
It was only about exhalation. It was just, the inhalation just happens.
Yes.
It's not important.
Yes. I do a lot of music for television and TV commercials and production, and I am often tinkering with the recipe, how much of that in my life, how much other work I need to do to feel fulfilled. You said this thing earlier about how, when somebody's going to pay you for your work, it motivates you on a lot of levels. You feel valued, you understand what your task is, all of that. I was very surprised to see how much of that work you did, because it seemed to be so separate from the kind of narrative of self-discovery and the journey of sharing your process with the world. Everything we've been talking about is kind of a piece. And then there's this whole other part of your career where you scored TV shows, and, that's a very solitary, it can be artful, but, it's a very different kind of process. I want to know how you manage that.
Yeah, it's just something I think about a lot, about the management of it or the lack of management of it. When I got off the road, or I should say when I was living in New York in the 80s, and even before that, I was always doing somebody's student film, and I was doing Swatch watches commercials. I was doing music for MTV. I did Issey Miyake, the designer's backstage. We were back with all these models, and I used my Tascam Porta Studio and made this really weird and interesting music for fashion shows. The other thing about, quote, creative types is that they understand what they have to do to keep on creating. And they find, at least I found, a lot of joy in composing, even for television shows, which were so micromanaged and so seemingly disparate from the work that I do. It was another form of music that I sort of learned. I could have learned it in a deeper way, but things were happening so quickly. When you get on one of those shows, it's a runaway train. The first major show I got on was called Judging Amy. And the producers, Amy Brenneman and a woman named Barbara Hall, were in L.A., obviously. And one of my songs, Always in Disguise, was one of the first tracks on KCRW's, which is like the cool public taste-making station. And that was on their first compilation. So when they learned that I also did scoring, they thought, well, this would be cool to get this guy that isn't a regular scoring guy.
Yes.
And it turned out that I became a regular.
I was going to say, as soon as you start scoring, you're a regular scoring guy.
Because the speed at which you have to create is so incredible. And because the tools, the technologies that exist allow you to make many versions, of course, then you have to make many versions, which quadruples the work. So I would sit in my lumbar support chair for sometimes 18 hours a day, and I always took off Shabbos. I never worked on Shabbos and holidays. So it was 63 days out of every year or something. I haven't factored in all the holidays, Sukkot and Yom Kippur and everything, that I couldn't work at all.
Yeah.
So then I would have to stay up for days at a time.
To make up for it.
And I never took great pride in, like, I'm a TV composer.
Yeah.
Or a film, and did a number of films as well, which you get much more time for.
Yeah.
But the checks, when those residuals come, are what put my kids through all these colleges, which is, well over $1 million of,
education,
post-tax money, And that was really motivating in a way. When we're talking about the relationship to my music, family, love, devotion, whatever that sort of stuff is, this was the active, physical manifestation of that kind of stuff. One of the shows that I was working on, Bones, got a new producer, and the show ended. I had a bunch of shows at one time, and a lot of these shows that were so hard to get, most of them didn't last even one season, and they were so hard to get. I should say the funnest time of the show was figuring out the palette and then showing it to the producer and sort of not selling them, but saying, this is, my understanding. And there was something really interesting and beautiful about, with whatever tools you had at hand, whatever level of musician you are, you can always do it.
Yep.
If you understand deeply the nuances of the emotion that the producer wants to create. Sorrow could have 1,000 shades. Joy the same. Mystery, humor is extraordinarily hard to do. What tells the audience, for something that's not patently funny, that this is something you can laugh
Yes,
to.
you're allowed to laugh.
I guess for me, I started trying to get so many more shows, and I did, and I got some other shows, and I just felt there was something else on the horizon for me. And I don't preclude doing more of that work. It just, you have to be in it. What you seem to have is a great balance with the music that is personal, the music that you help others accomplish, the music that you're doing to make other filmic, pieces more rich. I mean, it's great. I mean, what kind of balance do you want? And it's always out of balance. There's no such thing as balance.
Yeah.
If you got a paycheck coming for anything you do musically related in this day and age, you are the luckiest person in the world, because the music business fell off the edge of the frickin' cliff. And everyone will say to me, well, what about Beyonce? And I'll say, shut the fuck up. What are you talking about?
Yes. I absolutely agree with you, man. And it is not lost on me. I mean, yes, I'm tinkering with the balance. Yes, it's always out of balance. But it does need to be recognized what a crazy privilege it is to be living a creative life when all signs seem to be pointing away from that.
Right. And to be, really making...
Yeah.
Playing instruments in this room, I see. Like, you remember that was a thing they called a drum set? Yeah. What is that? Ludwig?
Yeah.
Ludwig? Yeah.
Yeah, I had a conversation with a saxophone player a couple of weeks ago, one of the great living jazz saxophone players, this guy, Chris Potter. And I said, I can't believe I'm going to ask you this question, but does it ever occur to you that you are supporting your family by blowing through this tube? That's what you do.
Oh, my God. It's so right. It's such a weird job. I've said on stage before, do you guys realize what we're doing up here? These aren't instruments. They're invisible sound wave shapers.
Yes.
And that's what we do. We're kids.
Yep.
It's insane.
Yep. And you put 4 kids through college with that. Peter, man, what a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo.
There he was, my friends, my new friend, Peter Himmelman. I get the feeling I could have talked to him for another couple of hours, and who knows, maybe one of these days I will. But either way, I'll be back next week with another deep diving conversation. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.